So what are some of Colombia's best towns? Hi all, I'm Israel and you're watching my travel channel where I talk all things Colombia. So a couple of months ago I made a video where I listed my top 5 cities to visit in Colombia, but I feel I'd be remiss to not also mention some of the country's towns, as there really were quite a few that left just as much, if not more of an impression on me. Now I'm not going to call this my top 5 Colombian towns, as to be honest, I've only visited a handful, so I don't think I'm in a position to give a ranking, but I can tell you about the ones I have visited and would recommend. So with that, let's start with a town in Quindío, one of the 3 departments that makes up the Coffee Triangle. The very first municipality to be founded in this department was a town called Salento. Like many towns on this list, one of the main reasons it remains popular is for its unmarred, beautiful colonial buildings. The architecture you'll see here is of a style called barreque, which was a popular building technique in Colombia throughout much of the 19th century. What makes the buildings truly striking though is just how brightly painted they all are. I mentioned this in my video about why I love Colombians, but one thing I found is that when it comes to things they're devoted to, there's no shame in absolutely letting loose with passion. This is evident in just how liberal they are with the colour choices here. In a country like my own, people just wouldn't be bold enough to paint buildings like this, but in Colombia, it's wonderful to see how celebrated colour is. Besides the buildings, perhaps the other main reason for the town's popularity is its proximity to the Cocora Valley, located just 11 kilometers away. The valley's home to the world's largest palm trees, the Quindío wax palms, and is arguably one of the prettiest areas of Los Nevados National Park. You can reach it via jeeps that regularly depart from Salento, which are an experience in and of themselves, given how fun they are to ride when standing up on the back. If you're new to Salento, I'd very much advise you to not skip out on visiting the valley. It'd be honestly like going to Paris and not seeing the Eiffel Tower. It's kind of the big attraction. That's not to say the town has no other charms for itself though. You'll likely find yourself spending a good amount of time browsing through the many souvenir shops that sell a lot of artisan products such as jewelry, kitchenware and mountain wear garments like the Ruana. The town also has an incredible lookout point of the Andes mountain range and the Cocora Valley, which is even better during sunrise and sunset. If you're interested in visiting, I'd recommend staying in Salento for a couple of nights, as this way you'll be able to dedicate a day for the Cocora Valley and still have time to look around the town, which I should add you can easily do on foot, as it's like roughly only 500 square meters in size. I just recommend bringing as much cash with you as you need, as there's next to nowhere that takes card here, and whilst there are some ATMs, there's no guarantee they'll work with your card, so better to be safe and take some cash with you. In fact, this is the case for all the towns on this list, so just bear that in mind. Next up, I've chosen a town that admittedly isn't for everyone, but for those who are interested, it's a nice little treat. I'm talking about Aracataca in the department of Magdalena. Now this would be a fairly run-of-the-mill town if it wasn't for one thing, and that is that it's the hometown of the famous Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the grandfather of magical realism. For anyone not in the loop, this is a hugely popular literary genre across South America and even throughout the world. It's categorized as stories that take place in a realistic, true-to-life setting, but are sprinkled with some fantastical, magical elements that are portrayed in a very grounded, matter-of-fact kind of way, as opposed to being the core focus of intrigue. Marquez's most famous book is by far Cien Años de Soledad, or 100 Years of Solitude, and this book was really the main reason I visited Aracataca to begin with, as the town's not only where Marquez grew up, but also the main inspiration for the book's fictional town, Macondo. And this is why I say this isn't a town for everyone, as if you haven't read the book or any of his other works that are inspired by the town, I think a lot of the appeal will be lost on you. Despite being called Macondo in his books, Marquez was pretty much writing about his hometown through the ages, albeit with fictional characters and some other fun stuff thrown in. Even then, he seemed to have based a lot of the characters on his own family, and the fantastical elements are often rooted in cultural symbolism. So look, my point is, you go to Aracataca, you're going to Macondo. I mean, let's face it, they even had a vote on changing the name to Macondo once, so no one's kidding themselves here. Anyway, as someone who read the books, it was actually quite exciting for me to see a lot of these things that I recognized from it, like the railroad or the canal or the nearby banana plantations. These were things I'd read about in a fictional story and had envisioned in my head for several months, and so when I then go to this town and see the real life counterparts, it's pretty surreal. Now, aside from just recognizing sites from Marquez's books, there is a major tourist attraction here as well, a recreation of his original family home, which functions as a museum dedicated to the history of his upbringing. Although the house isn't the original, it is located on the same block and it contains many original furniture items and other belongings from Marquez and his family. This really is the main attraction, so you probably won't need to stay more than a night in the town to see everything you want. You can even see it all in a day trip if you left early, like it's only about an hour or so from Santa Marta. But if you do stay the night, there is a hotel that's actually themed around Cien Años de Soledad. It's a little kitsch, but for just the night, it's a unique experience. Alright, moving from Magdalena down to the department of Santander, the next town I wanted to talk about is a place called Barichara. So there are actually a lot of pretty colonial towns throughout Santander, like Piedecuesta and Curiti, along with some amazing canyon views from Aratoca and some fun adventure sports in San Gil, but of all of these places, Barichara would have to be my favourite. Being a colonial town, there are some similarities in architecture you'll notice between here and Salento, although to be honest, I did find Barichara to be a little more elegant and tranquil. I'm all for colourful buildings, but I also love the whitewashed look, especially when paired with cobblestone streets. I wouldn't be surprised if this was the most undisturbed of all the colonial villages on this list, as literally every building looks like it's straight out of the 18th or 19th century. For this reason, it's actually been famously known in the country as the prettiest town in Colombia for decades. Now, I should say the tranquility and elegance of this town are really its main appeals, as there's not a whole lot to do here. Most of the enjoyment just comes from wandering the cobblestone streets and soaking in the atmosphere. There are a couple of lookout points though, where you'll get some great views of the canyons that flank the town. Sadly, I didn't know about this when I went, but I think the view from Aratoca is arguably better anyway, which I did get a chance to see. By the way, this canyon, the Chicamocha Canyon, is actually the second biggest in the world, so definitely worth checking out from a lookout wherever you may be. Getting back to Barichara though, something else I should note is that it was actually the biggest inspiration for the village in Disney's Encanto. Although the outer biome in the movie was based on the Cocora Valley, the village itself draws heavily from Barichara's aforementioned colonial buildings and cobblestone streets. To that end, I had a similar kind of experience to Aracataca in that even when visiting for the first time, there was this sense of familiarity, having already seen it through the lens of a fictionalized interpretation. In the case of Barichara, even smaller things like the dresses traditional to the region that the waitresses were wearing, I was like, oh hey, I've seen that. I don't know, I think it's just kind of cool that there's this massive worldwide phenomenon of a movie that's become an animated classic, and it's based on this tiny little town in rural Colombia that most people don't know about. And when I say most people, by the way, I'm including tourists in Colombia as well. Santander, for some reason, doesn't seem to get the influx of tourists that you see in other departments, so despite this being one of the prettiest towns in the country and the main inspiration for an international box office hit, you'll find it to be very quiet, with only a few tourists other than Colombians. In terms of getting there, probably the easiest way via public transport is to get a bus from Bucaramanga or Florida Blanca to San Gil, and then from San Gil to Barichara. It's about 4 hours to San Gil from these cities, and then another 40 minutes or so from there to Barichara. So yeah, Barichara, definitely a hidden gem. For the next town though, I've chosen one that should be easier to access for most of you, as it's just over an hour out of Bogota, and that is Zipaquira. Now this one's actually a lot bigger than all of the other entries on this list, to the point of being considered a city, but to be honest, it kind of felt more like a large town to me. It's also the oldest town on this list, having been founded in 1600, although I don't believe any of the current buildings are quite that old. Still, there's plenty of colonial buildings, houses and churches from as early as the 18th century, and being a larger town, you'll find some denser history to uncover here, which you can learn about via any of its museums or history tours. Now that's all well and good, but the one thing that really sets Zipaquira apart from the other towns on this list is its main tourist attraction, the Salt Cathedral. This truly would have to be one of the most dedicated displays of Catholicism throughout all of Colombia. Like, if you remember what I was saying earlier about how Colombians go all out when they're devoted to something, this is absolutely applicable to their religious beliefs, and the Salt Cathedral is a prime example of that. It's essentially a Catholic church built underground within the tunnels of a salt mine. When I first heard about it, I thought that would mean that it'd just be like a single underground chapel, which, you know, would already be impressive, but after visiting, I can tell you now, it is so much more than that. Before you even get to this, they've carved out all of these alcoves that contain various symbolistic designs of the cross. There's 14 of them in total, and they were made as an interpretation of the 14 Stations of the Cross, which is a tradition held across several denominations of Christianity. The idea is that each station symbolizes a different point in Christ's journey on the day of his crucifixion. It essentially serves as a sort of conceptual microcosm of spiritual pilgrimage, since people physically walk through it all and have the opportunity to contemplate Christ's passion and pray at the pillars they have at each point. I think regardless of your beliefs, it's all very much something to behold from a design perspective, especially once you get through the stations and arrive at the main chapel, or chapels I should say, as it turns out there are actually 3 of them symbolizing Christ's birth, life and death. With the intricate carvings surrounding you, these naves are very ornate, but as with the stations, what really brings them to life is the use of coloured lights, which add an unexpected modern twist. Now, once I got through these chapels, I really thought that'd be it, but there's actually still a whole lot more. Admittedly, after this point, I think there were probably a few too many adjunct areas. I mean, the water mirror was cool, but then they also have all these gift shops and a 3D documentary, and I think they even had laser tag or an escape room or something. At that point, I was just like, alright, I get it. Anyway, I know I've spent most of this one just talking about the Salt Cathedral instead of Zipaquira, but it really is the main event there. I should say too that the mine's actually part of the larger salt park, which has a museum and a reservoir, among other things, so definitely no shortage of things to see here. Moving on to the final town on this list though, I've actually saved my favourite here for last, and that is Guatapé. Part of the department of Antioquia and just a couple of hours drive from Medellin, Guatapé is known for many things, not least of which is this giant nearby rock called El Peñón, which you can scale via the attached stairs for an amazing view of the surrounding reservoir from the top. The rocks actually also claim to be owned by another nearby town called El Peñón, but this has been disputed between both towns for ages, to the point of some people even trying to graffiti the word Guatapé on it once. Now, this rock was actually the main reason I decided to visit Guatapé to begin with, but when I arrived, I was pleasantly surprised to find that the town itself had a whole lot of charm of its own. Without a doubt, the colourful facades of the buildings are the first thing to draw your attention here. I mean, I thought Salento was colourful, but dang, this was on another level. Apparently the town's residents are so proud of this that they're even competitive with each other about who has the most colourful house. Once again, they certainly can't be faulted for their dedication, because this place gives Barbie Land a run for its money. The most famous area of the town would have to be this laneway with suspended umbrellas, which is of course very popular for photo ops, and this is right next to an extremely colourful plaza with various restaurants. Outside of being colourful, Guatapé is also known for these murals on every building and house called zocalos. Each one of these tells a story or represents something that's meaningful to the family of the house, and in the case of the shops, they generally relate to what's being sold. Like many of the towns on this list, a lot of the joy just comes from wandering the streets, and that might just be more true for Guatapé than any other town, as this whole place is an absolute visual treat. In terms of things to do, the town itself is the standard touristy fare with a lot of souvenir shops and restaurants and the like, but there are also a few things to do nearby. I already mentioned El Peñón, which you can reach from Guatapé via any of the tuk-tuks, who will taxi you there by the way. Outside of that though, there are actually some boat tours that'll take you around the reservoir, and I believe you can also book a helicopter flight over it in case the views from the rock weren't enough for you. There's also a lake right next to the town where you'll find various cruises, including this bootleg Disney cruise that I find absolutely hilarious. There are also tours and hire options available for jet skiing, sailing, kayaking, and paddleboarding on this lake, so no shortage of water sports if you're into that. Anyway, I'm gonna wrap this one up here. Those were 5 Colombian towns I visited and would highly recommend. I must say, towns in Colombia often seem to be a bit more novel and interesting than in other countries of the world. I mean, I'm sure there's a whole lot of non-eventful Colombian villages as well, but in my country, for instance, I really don't know if we have all that many exciting tourist towns at all. Like, I'm not exactly seeing TripAdvisor lists of top 20 things to do in Penrith. Whatever the case though, towns in Colombia seem to often have a lot of charm, so very much in your best interest to check them out. As always though, thanks for watching all this way. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe, bell, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao!